50 years ago, a group of self-described revolutionaries did something that shocked the world. They declared war on America, assassinated a school superintendent, robbed several banks, bombed several police cars, murdered an innocent bystander, kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst and convinced her to join their cause before most of the group burned to death in a fiery shootout in Los Angeles, right on live television. This webcast is about everything that made that story possible. And almost none of it is what I expected to find when I started looking. I came to this project with a set of beliefs about the Symbionese Liberation Army and the era that produced them. I had to dismantle most of those beliefs before I could tell this story honestly. This is the story of who the SLA really were, what they actually believed, and what it tells us about a nation that is still grappling with the same failures that produced them. But before I tell you about the Symbionese Liberation Army, I have to tell you first about the America that produced them. Patricia Hearst. You know that name, even if you weren't alive in 1974, when her abduction was splashed all over newspapers. Even if you've never read a word about the case, you know who she is. The 19-year-old heiress of one of the most powerful media dynasties in American history. A kidnapping victim turned revolutionary, bank robber, and bomber. Or so the story goes. She had been living in a Berkeley apartment with her fiancé when they came for her. The Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, a militant group operating in the Bay Area who had declared war on the United States just months before. On February 4th, 1974, Patricia was home on a weekday evening when suddenly there was a knock at the door. 2 men and 1 woman forced their way through the door. They beat the man she planned to marry. They dragged her down the stairs and threw her into the trunk of a car. Neighbors heard screaming and the sound of gunshots before the car disappeared into the night. Patricia then spent nearly 2 months locked in a closet while her captors read propaganda to her, forcing her to record taped messages to her parents, demanding the release of food for the needy of California. She did everything they asked of her, but they consistently reminded her that if the FBI or police found them, she'd be dead. But on April 3rd, a communique from the SLA was released to the press. In it, Patricia Hearst declared that she had been given the choice to be released or to join the SLA. And in her words, she had chosen to stay and fight. 12 days after this bombshell news that a kidnapped heiress had just become a revolutionary, a security camera captured her image with her comrades during a robbery. Armed, alert, moving through the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco with focused precision. Lip-reading experts later deciphered one statement she made as, "Up against the wall, motherfuckers." What happened in those 70 days is one of the most contested questions in American criminal history. Was Patricia Hearst a victim so thoroughly broken by captivity and terror that she ceased in any meaningful sense to be herself? Was she a willing convert, genuinely radicalized by the ideology of her captors? Or was she something more complicated than either of those 2 explanations allows? A young woman in a deadly situation making impossible choices, the full weight of which we have never honestly reckoned with. We are going to spend 13 episodes circling that question. Even if you already have an opinion, you will discover new information about Patty and the SLA. This is not just the story of Patty Hearst. By the time they dragged her out of that apartment, the SLA had already assassinated a man, an educator named Marcus Foster, the first Black superintendent of the Oakland Unified School District, a man who had devoted his life to the children the SLA claimed to be fighting for. They had already issued their manifesto 2 months before Foster's murder. They had already declared war on what they called the fascist American state. They had already been shaped by forces that had been building for years, forces that had nothing to do with a 19-year-old heiress and everything to do with the volatile and in many ways entirely rational fury of a generation that had watched this country betray itself over and over again and decided finally that they were done watching. Patty Hearst is the reason most people have heard of the Symbionese Liberation Army. She is not the reason the Symbionese Liberation Army existed. This series is about the reason they existed. It is about what this country was doing to its own people in the years before that February night in Berkeley, the war it was fighting abroad on lies, the war it was fighting at home against its own citizens, the systematic destruction of every movement that tried to build genuine power in the communities that needed it most. It is about the ideas that moved through prison visiting rooms and radical communes and late night arguments in kitchens in the Bay Area and around the nation, eventually producing a group of fewer than a dozen people who convinced themselves they were soldiers in a revolution that the communities they were trying to liberate had no interest in joining. It is about what they got right, and it is about what they got catastrophically, irredeemably, homicidally wrong. And it is about this, the things they were fighting, the institutional failures, the racial injustice, the corporate capture of democracy, the prison system, the systematic destruction of Black leadership did not end when most of the SLA burned to the ground in Los Angeles in May of 1974. They did not end with the arrest of Patricia Hearst and others in September of 1975 or their trials. They did not end with her controversial pardon issued in 2001 by outgoing President William Jefferson Clinton. They metastasized, they deepened. They are with us now, in fact, in forms the SLA never lived to see and yet would have recognized immediately. My name is H. Allegra Lansing. Welcome to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. This is a history webcast, a true crime story, and so much more. We begin not with the kidnapping, not with the robbery. We begin with the war. You already know this story. Maybe you lived it. Maybe you remember the draft numbers announced on television, birth dates pulled from a bowl like some grotesque lottery, and a young man's entire future tilting on a single digit. Maybe you remember the arguments that split dinner tables in college campuses and friendships that had endured everything else up to that moment. Maybe you remember the names of boys from your neighborhood who went and didn't come back, or those who came back as ghosts of their former selves, and the painful silence that settled over their families afterward, a silence harder than ordinary grief. Or maybe you know this story the way younger generations know it, from history classes, from documentaries, from Platoon and Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now, from the faded photographs of protesters and burning villages that have become so familiar that they've almost stopped meaning anything. Here is what those photographs and films don't fully convey: the accumulated weight of living through it in real time. The way trust erodes, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, incrementally, over years of official statements that didn't match what you were seeing with your own eyes. The way a generation moves from faith to doubt to something darker and more permanent, a knowledge you can't unknow. The knowledge that your government will lie to you, that it has lied to you, that the lie cost lives, and that the people who told the lie will face no consequences for it. That knowledge is where this story begins. American involvement in Vietnam did not arrive all at once, it crept. Advisors became troops, troops became battalions, battalions became a war that consumed more than 58,000 American lives, and somewhere between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese lives. Official statements promised progress. Body counts were presented as evidence of success, as though the number of people killed was a meaningful measure of anything except the number of people killed. The metrics were constructed to tell a story that the reality on the ground refused to confirm. This was the first war Americans watched in something close to real time. The nightly news brought it into living rooms with an intimacy that no previous conflict had permitted. Helicopters slicing through jungle canopy, cameramen sharing cigarettes with battle-worn soldiers, children running from napalm that clung to their skin, coffins draped with flags arriving at airports across the country. And then in 1969, the photographs from My Lai, the massacre of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, hundreds of them, women and children and elderly men, killed by American soldiers and then covered up by the chain of command. Not the act of a single rogue soldier, a systemic failure, a deliberate concealment, a lie. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the alleged North Vietnamese attack on U.S. naval vessels that President Johnson used to justify the dramatic escalation of American military involvement, was, at minimum, catastrophically misrepresented to Congress and to the American people. The classified Pentagon Papers, leaked to the press in 1971 by Defense Department analyst Daniel Ellsberg, confirmed what many had suspected, that multiple administrations had systematically deceived the public about the scope, the costs, and the prospects of the war. The government had looked the American people in the eye and lied, not once, repeatedly. Kennedy's administration, Johnson's, Nixon's, as a matter of policy. You need to understand what that did to a generation. I'm talking about the lived experience of discovering that the institutions you were raised to believe in, the ones that held the whole structure of your life in place, were capable of that level of deliberate deception. The grief of it, the anger, and underneath both a kind of vertigo, the sensation of a floor giving way beneath your feet. The draft sharpened everything. While deferments existed for college students, for certain professions, for those with the resources and connections to navigate a system that rewarded exactly those qualities, the burden of the war fell with crushing disproportionality on the people least able to refuse it, on working class communities whose sons had no access to strategic exemptions, on Black and brown neighborhoods already living with the compounding weight of economic inequity and institutional exclusion, on rural white families whose boys had grown up believing that service was both duty and honor, and who reported even as the ground shifted beneath that belief. African Americans made up roughly 11% of the civilian population, but accounted for nearly 23% of combat deaths in the early years of the war. They were being asked to die in disproportionate numbers for a country that denied them equal rights at home. That contradiction was not lost on anyone paying attention. It was, in fact, one of the central arguments of the Black Power movement, one of the fault lines along which American political life was already cracking. The lottery made the randomness of fate visible in a way that was almost unbearable. A birth date drawn from a bowl on national television, a number called, and a life redirected toward a war that growing numbers of Americans believed was unjust, unwinnable, or both. Some fled to Canada rather than serve. Some burned their draft cards in public, accepting the legal consequences as a form of witness. Some reported dutifully, believing in service even as their doubts multiplied. Many returned carrying wounds that were visible. Many more returned carrying wounds that were not, that would not be named or understood or treated for decades. Wounds that shaped the rest of their lives in ways they could not always articulate. These men came home changed. Some came home radicalized in a way that had nothing to do with campus politics or counterculture ideology. They had seen what American military power actually looked like in practice, what it did to the people on the receiving end of it, what it did to the soldiers ordered to deliver it. They had been lied to about why they were there and what they were doing, and they came home to a country that either wanted to celebrate them as heroes for a war it was beginning to be ashamed of, or blame them as criminals for a war it didn't want to think about too hard. Before there was an SLA, before there was a Black Panther Party, before there was a Weather Underground or a Black Liberation Army, or any of the organizations we are going to spend this series examining, before any of that, there was a business decision. This is what we begin with. Not an ideology, not a grievance, not a political movement. A business decision made by the English colonists of the early 17th century, driven by the same logic that drives every business decision: profit. Land in the American colonies was abundant. Labor was scarce. Indigenous populations had already been decimated by disease and conflict and could not be enslaved at scale. White indentured servants were expensive, had rights, and eventually had to be freed. The solution the colonial economy arrived at, the solution that would shape every aspect of American life for the next 4 centuries and perhaps forever, was the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1619 and the formal end of the trade in 1808, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African human beings were forcibly transported to the Americas. The Middle Passage, the crossing from the West African coast to the New World, killed approximately 2 million of them. The ones who survived arrived in chains, stripped of their names, their languages, their families, their religions, and every legal protection that existed for others in the civilization that enslaved them. They built this country. That is not metaphor. That is economic fact. The cotton picked by the enslaved people of the colonies became the raw material for the textile mills of New England and Britain, which drove the Industrial Revolution. The tobacco they cultivated built the fortunes of the founding fathers. The sugar they processed in the Caribbean financed the banking houses of London and Amsterdam and New York. The infrastructure of American capitalism, the ports, the railroads, the financial instruments, the legal structures protecting property, was all built on the labor of enslaved people and the capital generated by that labor. And the people who performed that labor received nothing for it. Not wages, not freedom, not legal recognition of their humanity. Nothing for generations. When slavery ended, when the Civil War concluded and the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, the question of what came next was the most consequential question in American history. The formerly enslaved were freed without land, without capital, without legal protection, without political power, and in most of the South, without any realistic means of economic survival that did not involve laboring for the same white families who had owned them weeks before. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, the land redistribution that would have given formerly enslaved people an economic foundation, was rescinded by Andrew Johnson almost immediately. The Freedmen's Bureau, which briefly provided some federal support, was defunded and dismantled. Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877, during which federal troops enforced civil rights in the South and Black men voted and held office in significant numbers, was a genuine experiment in multiracial democracy It produced black senators, black congressmen, black judges, black sheriffs. It built public schools for the first time across large parts of the South. It created the legal and political infrastructure for a genuinely inclusive democracy. Then the federal government withdrew its troops in 1877 as part of a political compromise, and the white power structure of the South set about destroying everything Reconstruction had built, with extraordinary efficiency and extraordinary violence. Through the Ku Klux Klan and the White League and the Red Shirts and 100 other paramilitary organizations that operated with the open support of local law enforcement and the tacit consent of a federal government that had decided it was done caring. Through murder and arson and economic terror, through the methodical elimination of black political power by any means necessary, up to and including massacres. And then, with black political resistance suppressed and federal oversight withdrawn, through the law itself. Read the 13th Amendment carefully. It says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." Except as punishment for crime. That exception is the hinge on which the next century turns. The states of the former Confederacy, and soon enough states well beyond the former Confederacy, understood immediately what that clause permitted. Black men were arrested for vagrancy, for loitering, for being unemployed, for offenses that existed specifically to criminalize black life and that were not enforced against white men. They were convicted in proceedings that bore no resemblance to justice, and they were leased to private companies, to railroads and mines and turpentine camps and plantations, whose foremen could work them to death without consequence. Because a dead convict cost nothing. He was simply replaced by another arrest. The profit motive of slavery was preserved intact. The legal fiction of criminal justice provided its cover. This is not an interpretation. This is documented economic history. Convict leasing was openly advertised. States competed for the business. The revenue went to state governments. The labor went to private industry. The human beings caught in the system had no recourse and no rights. They died at extraordinary rates. Their families could not find them. They simply disappeared into a system designed to make them invisible. Convict leasing gave way to chain gangs. Chain gangs gave way to the prison farms of the mid-20th century. Prison farms gave way to the modern mass incarceration system that the United States operates today, the largest prison system in the world, incarcerating more people in absolute numbers than any country on earth, with Black Americans comprising 40% of the prison population, despite being today 14% of the general population. The architecture changed. The function did not. Jim Crow built everything else. Segregation was the visible surface of a system designed at every level to ensure that Black Americans could not accumulate wealth, access education, exercise political power, protect their families from violence, or appeal to any institution for remedy. The law was an instrument of this system. The police were an instrument of this system. The courts, the banks, the real estate industry, the federal housing programs that built the white middle class while explicitly excluding Black Americans, all instruments of the same system. The wealth, or the absence of wealth, that these policies created is not ancient history. It is the economic reality that Black families in America live with today. Redlining, the federal government's policy of refusing to guarantee mortgages in Black neighborhoods, which made it impossible for Black families to build equity through home ownership during the same decades that home ownership was building the white middle class. did not end until 1968. The people who were redlined are alive today. Their children are alive. The wealth that was never accumulated, the equity that was never built, the inheritance that was never passed on, these are not historical abstractions. They are present tense economic facts. Systems of this scope and duration do not dissolve and the laws that enforce them are struck down. They leave behind the structures they created. Those structures persist. This is the ground that the civil rights movement was working with. This is what Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were attempting to dismantle. Not just the visible legislation of Jim Crow, but the entire architecture of racial subjugation that the legislation expressed and enforced. And they achieved genuine things. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Legislation that was genuinely important, genuinely hard-won, and yet sincerely insufficient. Insufficient because you cannot legislate away the consequences of 250 years of unpaid labor and legally enforced poverty. Insufficient because striking down segregation laws does not redistribute the wealth that segregation concentrated. Insufficient because the generation that came after the March on Washington looked at what had been won and saw with devastating clarity how much remained and how little appetite the country had for going further. The legislative victories of the civil rights movement told Black Americans that they had equal rights under the law. The material conditions of their lives told them something else. The gap between those two statements is where the next chapter of the story lives. It's where Malcolm X lived. It is where the Black Panthers lived. It is where the idea of revolution, the specific American 1970s idea of revolution that eventually produced the Symbionese Liberation Army, was born and nurtured and driven to its catastrophic conclusion. In the gap between legislative victory and the lived realities of the civil rights movement, the first generation of young radicals decided that America needed a different kind of movement entirely. In the summer of 1962, a group of students gathered at a camp on the shore of Lake Huron in Michigan and wrote a document they called an Agenda for a Generation. The Port Huron Statement, drafted largely by a young University of Michigan student named Tom Hayden, was not a revolutionary manifesto. It was something almost more radical than that. It was a sincere expression of belief that American democracy could be made to work, that the gap between what this country claimed to be and what it actually was could be closed if enough people cared enough to close it. The organization behind it, Students for a Democratic Society, was built on that belief. Reform, participation, faith in the system's capacity to respond to pressure from below. That faith would not survive the decade. Like a lot of people, I believed that the SLA were radicalized in large part by the Vietnam War protest movement. That was an assumption I had to release as I began my research and writing. The people who formed the Symbionese Liberation Army stumbled into a history so long and so deliberately obscured that when they finally encountered it, in books passed through prison bars, in late-night arguments in Berkeley communes, in the writings of people who had been telling the truth for decades, it felt like revelation. They were not wrong about the history. They were catastrophically wrong about what to do with it. But you cannot understand what they did until you understand what they found. And what they found was this: a country that had been built on slavery, that had preserved the economic function of slavery through every legal an extra-legal mechanism available to it that had suppressed every serious attempt to reckon with that history. That is the original sin, and that is the bedrock that the SLA and really the entire radical movement of 1970s America was built upon. In October 1966, two working-class young men named Huey Newton and Bobby Seale founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. They were students at Merritt College who had been reading voraciously and paying close attention to the world immediately outside their door. That world included an Oakland Police Department with a well-documented history of brutality toward Black residents, a city where Black families were systematically excluded from economic opportunity, and a national political movement in which the civil rights movement's legislative victories had done almost nothing to change the material conditions of Black life in northern cities. Newton and Seale had been reading Frantz Fanon, Mao, Malcolm X, and Robert F. Williams, writers who argued in different registers and from different traditions that oppressed people had both the right and the responsibility to defend themselves. Where Martin Luther King offered a vision of integration and moral suasion, Malcolm offered something harder and more immediate: the insistence that Black people did not need to wait for white America's permission to claim their own dignity and defend their own lives. What Newton and Seale built from that reading was not primarily a fighting force. Sitting in the offices of the North Oakland Service Center, surrounded by pamphlets and manifestos, Newton dictated and Seale transcribed the document that would become the Panthers' foundation, the 10-point program. Read it carefully, and what you find is not a call to violence. It is a call to basic human dignity, full employment, decent housing, adequate education, an end to police brutality, exemption from military service for Black men being asked to fight for a country that denied them equal rights at home, the release of Black prisoners, whom the Panthers considered political prisoners of a system designed to criminalize Black life. These were not fringe demands. They were demands of people who had watched the distance between American promise and American reality grow wider every year, and had decided they were no longer willing to pretend the gap didn't exist. The patrols came first, small groups of Panthers, legally armed, monitoring police interactions with Black citizens on Oakland streets. When police stopped a Black driver, which happened constantly and which frequently escalated into something uglier, Panthers would appear, weapons visible, and remind the citizen of his legal rights. The legality was unimpeachable. The effect on the police was electric. Here were Black men who would not be intimidated, who knew the law, who were not asking permission. The image that traveled, the berets, the leather jackets, the rifles, was real, but it was only part of the picture. What the cameras spent less time on was everything else the Panthers were doing simultaneously. The free breakfast for school children program, which by 1969 was feeding thousands of children every morning in cities across the country, at a time when the federal government had no such program. The free health clinics, the legal aid programs, the community organizing, the institution building in neighborhoods that the government had largely decided were not worth investing in. This is the part that history has most thoroughly obscured. The Black Panther Party was, at its core, a community institution. It was filling gaps that the government had created and then refused to fill. And that, not the guns, not the rhetoric, not the confrontations with police, is what made the Panthers genuinely dangerous to the existing power structure. An organization that can feed your children, provide your health care, and organize your neighborhood is an organization with real community power. Real community power in communities the government had decided were unimportant, was the one thing that could not be tolerated. In Detroit, a white poet and activist named John Sinclair founded the White Panther Party in direct solidarity with Newton and Seal's organization, a symbolic and organizational statement that white radicals had an obligation, not just an interest, in supporting Black liberation. There was a chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Panthers who understood better than almost anyone in this movement what real power actually looked like. His name was Fred Hampton, and in 1969, he was 21 years old. What he was building and what happens to him next is where this story turns. Fred Hampton was doing something that frightened the established order more than any gun ever could. He was building a genuine multiracial coalition of poor and working class people in Chicago, Black Panthers, white Appalachian migrants from the Young Patriots organization, Puerto Rican activists from the Young Lords. He was feeding children breakfast every morning. He was negotiating truces between Chicago street gangs. He was, by every account of people who knew him, one of the most gifted political organizers of his generation. Charismatic, disciplined, and utterly committed to the people he served. And again, he was 21 years old. On December 4th, 1969, at approximately 4:45 in the morning, Chicago police officers, acting in coordination with the FBI, raided the apartment where Hampton slept. An FBI informant had slipped a powerful barbiturate into his drink the night before. Hampton was unconscious beside his pregnant girlfriend when officers entered the bedroom and shot him twice in the head at close range. The subsequent investigation revealed that nearly all of the bullets fired that morning had been fired by police, not by the Panthers inside the apartment. It revealed that the FBI had provided a floor plan of the apartment to their informant, allowing officers to locate Hampton's bed precisely enough to shoot him in his sleep. What the murder of Fred Hampton demonstrated, with a clarity that no amount of official explanation could obscure, was the shocking and lethal act the state was willing to do to someone who was feeding children breakfast and organizing poor people across racial lines. Not someone planting bombs, not someone planning an assassination, someone building power from the bottom up, the way democracy is supposed to work. For a generation of young people watching this happen, the murder of Fred Hampton was not just an outrage, it was an education. It taught them exactly what the state was afraid of, and it taught them exactly how far the state was willing to go to prevent it.
You have to understand that people have to pay the price for peace. If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you dare not to struggle, then goddamn it, you don't deserve to win. Let me say peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. Let me say it in the spirit of liberation.
There is a program you have probably heard of, but may not fully understand. It is called COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program. COINTELPRO was not a response to violence. The program began in 1956, aimed initially at the Communist Party USA, and expanded throughout the 1960s to target virtually every significant movement for social change in America. The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, the Young Patriots, SDS, the Puerto Rican Independence Movement, and dozens of others. It predated the violence of the radical underground by over a decade. In some documented cases, it provoked that violence deliberately. The program's methods were comprehensive and illegal. FBI agents infiltrated organizations and reported on their activities. They manufactured evidence to discredit leaders. They sent anonymous letters designed to destroy marriages, friendships, and political alliances. They spread disinformation, fake pamphlets, forged correspondence, fabricated accusations of informing to manufacture conflict between organizations that might otherwise have been allies. They worked with local police to facilitate arrests. And in the case you just heard, the murder of Fred Hampton, they provided the floor plan that allowed officers to locate a sleeping man's bed precisely enough to shoot him twice in the head. J. Edgar Hoover was explicit about the program's purpose. He wanted to prevent the rise of what he called a Black Messiah, a leader who could unite the disparate voices of Black power into a coherent political force. He wanted to prevent the formation of a functional, multiracial coalition of the left. He wanted, in his own words, to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize organizations he considered threats to the existing order. Notice what is not on that list. Prevent violence. That was never the goal. The goal was to destroy effective organizing. COINTELPRO did not distinguish between the radical groups planting bombs and the Panthers running breakfast programs. It targeted both with equal ferocity because both represented the same threat. The possibility that poor and working class people across racial lines might build enough power to demand a genuine redistribution of it. We were robbed of that possibility deliberately, illegally, with the full resources of the federal government of the United States. While the FBI was working to dismantle the Panthers from the inside, a separate but related reckoning was underway in the white radical left. And it's worth pausing to name what was actually driving it. A prevailing myth is that the radical violence of the early 1970s was primarily a protest against the Vietnam War. In fact, while the groups that emerged from this period were vehemently anti-war, the war itself was rarely their primary focus. What the underground movement was truly about, what it was always about, was the plight of Black Americans. Every significant radical underground group in the 1970s was concerned, first and foremost, with the struggle of Black people against police brutality, racism, and government repression. These were mostly white people, mostly educated, mostly from families that had given them every advantage the country had to offer. And they looked at what had just happened to Fred Hampton, plus the murders, the mass incarceration, the deliberate destruction of every organization that tried to build genuine power in Black communities. And they were so enraged by it that they were willing to take up arms in response. They were wrong about what to do with that rage. They were not wrong to feel it. From the Panthers' most militant members emerged the Black Liberation Army, an underground organization that took the vision of armed struggle and acted on it, carrying out attacks on police officers in cities across the country. The same logic that produced the BLA was visible in a different register in the prosecution of John Sinclair. His White Panther Party had been a gesture of solidarity. The state's response to him had nothing to do with solidarity at all. Sinclair's 10-year prison sentence for possession of 2 marijuana cigarettes, 10 for 2 as it was known, became a cause célèbre, a demonstration, as if more were needed, of the state's willingness to use the legal system as a weapon against anyone who challenged it, regardless of how minor the pretext. If you want to understand why a generation lost faith in the institutional left, you don't need to read a book. You need to look at 1 week in August of 1968. Thousands of young people, anti-war protesters, McCarthy supporters, people who still believed that the Democratic Party could be the vehicle for the change they needed, gathered in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. What they were met with was a police force, authorized and encouraged by Mayor Richard Daley, that beat them in the streets. on national television, in front of the cameras they had hoped would broadcast their message to the country. Inside the convention hall, the party nominated Hubert Humphrey, who had not entered a single primary, who represented the continuation of the Johnson administration's Vietnam policy, over Eugene McCarthy, who had galvanized millions of young voters with a genuine anti-war platform. The message was unambiguous. Your votes don't count. Your voices don't matter. And if you persist in making yourself heard, we will have you beaten in the street and call it maintaining order. The cruelty of Chicago was not just the violence. It was the combination of the violence outside and the procedural betrayal inside, both happening simultaneously, both captured on camera, both defended afterward by the people who had ordered them. Chicago didn't just radicalize the people who were there. It radicalized everyone watching, which, thanks to television, was most of the country. If peaceful protest produces this, they asked, what's left? That question had no comfortable answer, and the people wrestling with it most urgently were not dangerous radicals. They were students, veterans, teachers, community organizers, people whose faith in democratic institutions had been genuine, whose disillusionment had been earned through documented betrayals, and who were now standing in the wreckage of that faith with nowhere left to turn. By 1969, SDS, Students for Democratic Society, was fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. From that fracture emerged the Weathermen, later known as the Weather Underground. The story of how SDS moved from the Port Huron Statement to the Weather Underground is not a story of people becoming more extreme for no reason. It is a story of people watching repeatedly and with increasing precision the system respond to legitimate democratic pressure with indifference, with contempt, and finally with violence. Every march met with police batons, every petition filed and ignored, every electoral hope carefully cultivated and then methodically crushed by the machinery of a party that needed the votes of the young and the idealistic and had absolutely no intention of being accountable to them. What's important to understand about the Weathermen is not that they were crazy. Some of them were behaving erratically, but the analysis underneath the behavior was not irrational. They had watched the government lie about Vietnam for years. They had watched peaceful protesters beaten in the streets of Chicago. They had just watched Fred Hampton murdered in his bed. They had concluded, and this conclusion was not without evidence, that the American state was engaged in systematic violence against its own people, and that the appropriate response was not more petitions. Their public face, the person whose name became, for a generation of journalists and FBI agents alike, synonymous with the organization itself, was Bernadine Dorn, a law student from Wisconsin, brilliant, focused, simultaneously the most glamorous and most terrifying figure in the American radical movement. She had clerked for civil rights attorneys before any of this began. She had genuinely believed once in exactly the kind of reform Port Huron had promised. Chicago changed that. By the time she stood up at the founding gathering of the Weathermen and called for the group to bring the war home, to make Americans feel on their own soil some fraction of what American bombs were doing in Vietnam, she was no longer arguing for reform of any kind. She would spend years after that as one of the most wanted fugitives in the country, a face on FBI posters and post offices nationwide, while raising children underground, and never once, by her own account, regretting the diagnosis that put her there, only some of what she and her comrades chose to do about it. Alongside her were Bill Ayers, Jeff Jones, and a rotating cast of committed young people from largely privileged backgrounds who had decided that their privilege obligated them to revolt. In October 1969, the Weathermen staged what they called the Days of Rage in Chicago, an attempt to bring thousands of young people into the streets for a direct confrontation with the police. About 200 people showed up. They ran through the Gold Coast neighborhoods, smashing windows, fought with cops, and were largely arrested. It cost the organization over $2 million in bail. It alienated most of their potential allies. But the Weathermen drew a different conclusion. The failure wasn't the strategy. The failure was the scale. They needed to think smaller, move faster, work underground. On March 6, 1970, a townhouse in Greenwich Village exploded. Inside, 3 members of the Weather Underground had been assembling nail bombs, devices designed not to damage property, but to kill people when something went wrong. Diana Oughton, Ted Gold, and Terry Robbins died in the blast. The other occupants escaped into the street and went underground. The nail bombs they had been building were intended for a dance at Fort Dix, New Jersey. Soldiers and their dates would have been killed. 3 Weathermen died before they could kill anyone else, and in the aftermath, the surviving leadership made a decision. They would continue underground, they would continue bombing, but they would not kill. Every bombing would be preceded by a warning call. Property destruction, not murder, would be the tactic. This decision defined the Weather Underground for the rest of its active years. They bombed the Capitol. They bombed the Pentagon. They bombed corporate headquarters and government buildings across the country. Always with warnings, always miraculously without fatalities on the other side. But here is the thing that should make you furious. The bombs kept going off, yet the state never had to answer for Fred Hampton. Every explosion gave Hoover's FBI exactly what it needed to keep the cameras pointed at the wreckage instead of the bedroom where an unarmed, drugged 21-year-old had just been murdered in his sleep. The bombs kept going off, and the breakfast programs Hampton had built kept getting dismantled. The bombs kept going off, and the Black Panther Party destroyed itself from the inside by an operation so comprehensive and so illegal, it would not be fully exposed for years. The Weathermen had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They had made the underground real. They had demonstrated that a small, committed group of American radicals could go into hiding, evade the FBI for years, and continue to operate. And in doing so, they handed the government the single most useful tool it possessed, the ability to point at the violence and make the real grievances disappear. Every bomb was a gift to the people the bombers were trying to fight. And then on May 4th, 1970, Kent State University, Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on students protesting the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. 4 students were killed, 9 were wounded, 1 was permanently paralyzed. The students were not armed. Some of them were not even at the protest. They were walking between classes when the bullets found them. Kent State was not the first act of state violence against American protesters. It was not the most lethal, but it was the one that broke something irreplaceable, because these were white college students killed by the American military in the middle of the afternoon on a university campus. And initially, a significant portion of the country defended it. A Gallup poll taken shortly after found that most Americans blamed the students, not the Guard. Letters to newspapers expressed not outrage, but satisfaction. Bumper stickers appeared. The National Guard, 4. Students, 0. Construction workers in New York City beat anti-war protesters with their hard hats while police watched. The President of the United States called the protesters bums. The student strike that followed was the largest in American history. 4 million students, 900 universities. It has been almost entirely forgotten. It changed nothing. The war continued. The Guard was not prosecuted. We have been living in the aftermath of Kent State ever since. Not because of what the Guard did, because of what the country said afterward, because of the bumper stickers, because of the polls, because half the country looked at 4 dead students and felt nothing except the satisfaction of order restored. That is the wound that never healed, not just the bullets, the applause. What followed was exhaustion, a slow, bitter, irreversible exhaustion that COINTELPRO had engineered and Kent State had calcified. The coalitions that had been building, the multiracial alliances, the community institutions, the genuine grassroots power that Fred Hampton had been assembling, one breakfast program and one gang truce at a time, were gone, dismantled by infiltrators and informants and anonymous letters and, when necessary, bullets in the dark. The underground groups that filled the vacuum were not the cause of the movement's collapse. They were its symptom. Small, isolated, disconnected from the communities they claimed to represent, operating on a theory of history that required a mass uprising from people who were too exhausted, too surveilled, and too busy surviving to rise. Less than 1% of the bombings carried out by radical underground groups in the 1970s resulted in a fatality. The bombs were, in a grim and self-defeating way, mostly press releases, communiques with explosive punctuation. The country absorbed the violence into its background noise. Unless someone died, the press barely covered it. The grievances that had fueled a generation's rage were buried under the spectacle of the violence, exactly as designed, exactly as intended, exactly as COINTELPRO had planned from the beginning. The door that reform had held open was closing. Some people were trying to blow it off its hinges. Neither approach was working. And the people who had done the most to close that door, the people who had murdered Fred Hampton and surveilled the Panthers and manufactured conflict and destroyed coalitions, faced no consequences. None. The program wasn't even publicly acknowledged until 1971. The full extent of its operations wasn't known for years after that. We lost something in those years that we have never gotten back. A possibility, a coalition, a vision of what this country could have been if the people who feared it hadn't been so efficient at destroying it. That loss is not ancient history. It is the ground we are standing on right now. And in Oakland, in Berkeley, in the prison visiting rooms of Vacaville, a small group of people were drawing their own conclusions from the wreckage. None of the organizations we've named in this episode directly created the Symbionese Liberation Army. 250 years of slavery did not create the SLA on their own. Convict leasing and Jim Crow and redlining did not create the SLA on their own. The Vietnam War did not create the SLA. The Black Panthers did not create the SLA. COINTELPRO did not create the SLA. The Weather Underground did not create the SLA. Kent State did not create the SLA. What all of it created together, compounding across 3 centuries and then accelerating across 1 decade, was a world in which the SLA became not just imaginable, but, to the people who built it, morally necessary. A world in which a small group of human beings, educated, idealistic, burning with the escalating rage of people who believed they could see clearly what others refused to look at, could arrive at the conclusion that the only remaining language was violence. That conclusion was wrong. It was wrong tactically, strategically, and above all, humanly, in ways we are going to spend the rest of this series documenting with precision. But it did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from here, from a country that built its wealth on stolen labor and never paid the debt. From a country that answered every legitimate demand for justice with surveillance, infiltration, and bullets. From a country that watched 4 unarmed students die on a sunny afternoon and put a number on a bumper sticker like it was a football score or a joke. And if you are angry right now, some part of you is sitting with this and thinking that none of this should have been allowed to happen, that someone should have stopped it, that something is still deeply wrong. I'm asking you to hold on to that. Don't let it curdle into despair, and don't let it convince you that rage is the same thing as a plan. Because the people you are about to meet felt exactly what you're feeling right now. And I got 6 of them killed on live television. And I got an innocent woman killed in a bank. And I got a great man murdered in a parking lot. And it accomplished none of what they actually wanted.
Thank you for listening to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. This is H. Allegra Lansing. This is a story about a country at war with itself, and about what happens when a generation's fury collapses into the worst possible reaction. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not fail because the injustice they saw wasn't real. They failed because they chose violence. And violence is the one form of resistance that entrenched power already knows how to defeat. It has been defeating it for centuries. Everyone swept up in the movement would pay a cost beyond measure. Even an heiress to the nation's most powerful media empire. In my next episode of House on Fire, Sin Q. The story of the Symbionese Liberation Army didn't begin with a kidnapping or a bank robbery or even a manifesto. It began in a prison visiting room, and the man at the center of it was holding court with a group of young people who hung on his every word. But before there was Sin Q, there was Donald DeFreeze, a petty criminal, a documented police informant with no political ideology, and a compulsive relationship with weapons that had nothing to do with revolution. How he became the Field Marshal General of the SLA is one of the strangest and most troubling questions in this entire story. This webcast is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Red Shift by The Grey Room with Density and Time.